in any event, it's a really good example of how to interconnect our advocacy. This process takes place in Geneva. It takes place within the review mechanism with the CEDAW committee. But really, that's a national review process, right? So, how do we link our various activists within the national context when their country's CEDAW review is up for assessment to provide strategic inputs in terms of how gender justice policies and their governments works towards and commitments towards the ratification of CEDAW at national level and harmonizing with national policies is taking place. Also, the Human Rights Council as well. That's a really awesome example too of the same thing with the UPR, Universal Periodic Review. It's a similar process in which governments' commitments, international commitments to human rights are reviewed. So these are just some examples of opportunities, no, where we can link national advocacy directly into the international policy space. And lastly, I would say the high level political forum, which of course were under the auspices of Agenda 2030 still for quite a few more years. So, same thing on a rotating basis, governments work towards their meeting of Agenda 2030 commitments are reviewed. So, these are just a few examples of some of the key spaces that I would just sort of in brief summarize as uh, main human rights and development spaces ranging from Geneva, Human Rights Council, OHCHR to New York, UN headquarters. At the center of that, I have language mapping because one of the efforts that we've undertaken collectively with all of the regions through the advocacy working group is to begin to pull all of the normative framework documents, which is the agreed conclusions from many of these processes, no? Or for example, with CEDAW, the actual convention itself, our normative framework at the international level, and began to map that specifically for language on transforming patriarchal masculinities, dismantling patriarchy, work with men and boys. So and we've done this over the last few years, no, to be able to really analyze and assess where is the normative framework on the commitment to work with men and boys, and also to fine tune and direct our policy advocacy within these processes, right? I'll just give you a brief summary, of what we've assessed within that language mapping. And that's an ongoing, organic, live document because every year this whole cycle of sessions takes place, right? So we keep updating that document. And actually, that document, the latest one that we did was regional normative frameworks. So, African Union, for example, some of the main conventions anchored there, right? But across all the regions. So being able to now see the links between international and regional and all of these as tools for our national, regional, and global advocacy. And as a broad sweeping sort of analysis of what we're finding is the language is becoming more nuanced, whereas at the beginning it was sort of a superficial reference, no, to the need to engage men and boys. We are seeing a deepening, no, of the roles and responsibilities of men and boys towards the realization of gender equality. And one thing we've been trying to advance in the policy advocacy is really honing in and centering the need for accountability in the work to transform patriarchal masculinities and work with men and boys. But advancing the normative framework is quite complex, no? It's a intergovernmental negotiation, and those can be quite complicated to advance the line. Of course, this is all working, as I was mentioning, in the broader backdrop of backlash, right? And constriction within those negotiations as governments are seeking to actually push the bar backwards instead of forwards. So, and my last slide, I just wanted to quickly touch base on this concept of accountable advocacy because I think that's been absolutely paramount to the work that we've been carrying out as a collective and advocacy spaces. And again, it's the application of our accountability framework to the advocacy process and space and partnership building and movement building. And so I think in summary, how we would describe that is we're not going to a policy space to just push forward or advance the centering of more language or more dialogue or more attention on work with men and boys, right? We are seeking to be active actors standing in solidarity and meaningful partnership with the broader feminist LGBTQIA plus social environmental justice movements within a policy space, contributing our unique expertise on men and masculinities when that's relevant and needed, and centering that analysis within a broader dynamic, right, where we're really keeping in mind and considering uh, the power and privilege that we hold as organizations working on this agenda, noting how often it's prioritized, how often it's given more space and voice than women's rights, even though we're all actors working for gender justice, and keeping that really, being really cognizant of that. And I just would like to give you two examples in closing to really flush out what that looks like in practice. No, it can be a little nebulous when we discuss it um, just conceptually. No, so to ground it in what this looks like. So, in the 62nd session of the Commission on the Status of Women, we always carry out our policy advocacy on the agreed conclusions. It's the agreed upon document by all governments that is released at the end of the session. Most of the time, right? Some years there's been a failure in the negotiation with no agreed conclusion. This year, the 62nd year, it was 3 years ago, we received the zero draft. It's the first draft of the document that all activists begin to provide inputs on. And there were around 25 references to work with men and boys, and one reference to women human rights defenders, which there were efforts to strike that out of the text. No reference to comprehensive sexuality education. So, just to give you an example, right? It's like central, critical concerns of the feminist agenda, right? Not making it onto this document at the most critical space, right? Annually within the UN for follow up on the advancement of women's rights, and in parallel, work with men and boys, right? In no way nuanced, just need to work with men and boys, importance of engaging men and boys, centered 25 times. So, under accountable advocacy, our strategy was to recommend, right, the deletion of all these 25 references, moving towards one consolidated, nuanced paragraph that really centered the roles and responsibilities of men and boys towards the realization of gender justice, no? And really unpacking the need for dismantling patriarchal masculinity. So that's just one example of how we employ, no, if you will, accountable advocacy live in a policy space and act as meaningful actors in solidarity with the broader process. The last example I'd like to give is from the Human Rights Council. This year, the 35th session of the Human Rights Council, that was about 4 years ago, a resolution, a standalone resolution was presented on engaging men and boys in violence prevention and response. And so, because the agenda is prioritized many times over women's rights standalone resolutions, right? Just the topic itself being the center of an entire resolution sparked a lot of member state, which is the official name for governments in the international space, a lot of their attention and interest. And so actually in this case, we worked alongside feminist partners within Geneva, a coalition of organizations on SRHR, and basically utilized this amplified interest just because it was an engaging men and boys resolution to push for and actually achieve, right, alongside feminist movements within the Geneva advocacy space, the inclusion of comprehensive sexuality education, which had never happened in a resolution that was right, the same resolution that was typically always on women's rights without the focus of engaging men and boys. And so it was a huge success. And we did that working in collaboration with feminist movements, in a sense, utilizing the amplified attention to allow for the progress of the normative framework of key areas of concern, right, to us as part of the broader feminist movement, but of course, comprehensive sexuality education and SRHR, which is quite tough and always a point of contention. So, and this resolution, just to give you an example, usually around 40 to 50 governments sponsor a resolution or show support. Just because this was on engaging men and boys, there was over 84 member states, almost double, just to show the power dynamics, right, of the agenda and how we must be extremely cognizant of that whenever we're engaging in the political space. I'll leave it at that part, and I think I spoke too long and pass it back to Mapiwa. Thank you so much. And I'm going to share a few resources with you in the chat box too, should they be of interest.
So much, Jennifer, for sharing and painting the picture at the global level. Firstly, for painting the picture in terms of us understanding politically where we are, the pushback that we are currently experiencing, and which certainly also calls for us to come up with strategies in terms of how we respond to the pushback that we are seeing, the shrinking of spaces, how we begin to also work with feminist organizations in terms of how do we respond to this pushback, what do we do. And for me, also what has been important that came out is the aspect of accountability, that many times there's always the question of MenEngage, what do we stand for? Are we standing for boys or what? Which is a question that we're always engaging with and trying to respond to. This captured it very well in terms of explaining that responsibility of accountability and how we can make use of that accountability responsibility in our advocacy, and those practical examples you gave in terms of how to make use of the opportunity to then advance some of the interests that fall within the normative framework of what feminist organizations are pushing for. So those are some of the examples that really stood out for me. And so once, as we have already painted the picture at that level, we are now going to also take our conversation and bring it to the regional level and also engage with the work that is happening on a regional level. So we have a number of representatives that are coming from the different MenEngage regions. Now I'm going to request that Sheki Cornwell from Carrymen, and also share the experiences that they have in terms of advocacy from her region. I'll ask her to give a brief introduction of herself and then proceed to share with us on the regional advocacy from their end and some of the work that they've been doing. Thank you, Sheki. You can go ahead.
Thank you so much, Mapiwa. So as I was introduced as Shaki, I live in the beautiful island of Grenada, which is located in the Caribbean. And I represent Caribbean Action Network for Men. And it's interesting because when we think about, the lovely introduction, I think that Jennifer gave, it helps us to, really get the context of, how we operate regionally. And I'll piggyback on some of the points that she made, and just really pull the relevant connections to the Caribbean region. And I think one that stood out for me would have been around the shrinking space And, when we reflect on, Carimon and the work for gender equality over the last 10 years, without a doubt, what you would see is that the terrain has changed significantly. I remember for us in Grenada at Legal Aid and Counseling Clinic, which is one of the areas that I work, when the clinic had started to position itself in terms of, how are we going to, work accountably? And one of the things that we had to do was typically legal aids are dominated by male clients, because once you're doing criminal matters, you find that within the Caribbean, you're dominated by male clients. And the policy decision at the clinic, because we're not state owned, was really around, focusing on family law. And in doing that, what happened is that we were able to position ourselves to really support vulnerable women. And that policy decision also supported the rollout of one of the programs, male batterers intervention programs. And I remember, listening to the director affectionately talk about that process, where oftentimes you have to, and rightfully so, rationalize why, as a feminist organization, we're working with batterers. While we had a female intervention program, but Access for Justice was really showing that for a lot of the women, they really wanted, just for the violence to stop, right? And the system was not able to support that, because the penal system at the time only had the ability to incarcerate. While we recognize that it's still a crime, and if a crime has been committed, that a person should be incarcerated, the challenge was, how can we help these women, live a life free of violence, those who wanted to go back into those relationships. And so the rationalizing there of the male batterers intervention was really around, how can we give women what they wanted, and so that create a space where the violence can stop by working with the perpetrators in an accountable way. And so that was over 10 years ago, right? When the whole concept of working with men, with women, or persons from the women's movement or the feminist organization was something that, we struggle, and we still struggle with that to a great extent, in terms of creating space where we're recognizing the value sometimes of working with and engaging men and boys. And I suppose the point that Jennifer, reinforced consistently was that, working with men and boys accountably. And I think that was the argument that we were able to make as it relates to how do we help hold men accountable. And so within the program, it is really about helping men to be accountable for the actions and the wrongs that they've done. And so policy-wise, there's a shifting that's happening, and the shrinking space has really not necessarily helped, because we're talking about in the Caribbean region where, if we're going to be honest about where our resources come from, we recognize that if you think about the global level, a lot of the Caribbean islands are, while we're independent on paper, we depend a lot on international funding to do the work that we have to do. And many of the NGOs who, traditionally would have played a very powerful and strong role in terms of, agitating and holding state accountability, many of them have died. And it's sad because, when you're talking about running organizations that are not sustainable in terms of, earning something, you're working with vulnerable populations, and funding die, or the direction of the funds have changed, and these entities have to now make these decisions where you have very strong leaders who have to think about sustainability for themselves and their families and their livelihoods, and would have sometimes made shifts around, even career paths and decisions around that. And so the shrinking really for us has been about a movement, a closing of just in the last year. Several feminist organizations were forced to close their doors because of funding. And so advocacy around gender equality has to be shaped in a way that is really designed to help, some of these entities create business models that can help sustain their work. And it's very important, because when you think about over the last 10 years, when you had projects coming from the international playing field, like with the UN Trust Fund and lots of millions and millions of dollars invested into, civil society and different state actors. And then you turn around and these entities have gone. So you're talking about building capacity. They now have the tools to really do, advocacy work, and they've now gone because of they had to shift, they had to move because running these organizations was not a viable option for them in terms of their own livelihood and sustenance of their families. And so that shrinking environment really harmed, to a great extent, the advocacy within the Caribbean region, and just changing and turning tides, right? And so as I mentioned, one of the projects I remember in the last, would have been about 8 years ago, a lot of money invested around what we call state accountability. And it was really about helping states recognize that you made these commitments. And as Jennifer rightly stated, many, even within the Caribbean, all the Caribbean islands that where Caraman operates, they've all signed a number of these normative frameworks, right? And when it comes to accountability, it's really what I like to think about as a courtship dance, where they sign these agreements with the intent or the hope to, sometimes get some funding. And once the funding has come, then the accountability part of it is left out as it relates to sometimes, international or global donors are going to ask about, have you signed on to this, and demonstrate that, and as a prerequisite sometimes for obtaining funds. And so they can tick off that box and say, yes, we've done that. But when it comes to the rubber hitting the road, you recognize that a lot of there's no follow-up. So when you're thinking about even reporting procedures, right, and reporting processes that are tied to these some of these frameworks, a lot of the islands, it's not happening. And even in instances where it is happening, when you look at the reports, right, they're very favorable. And even civil society's ability to sometimes do the shadow reporting is challenged by the same shrinking resources, right? Where we have these funding agencies who sometimes give you monies for programs. And so they're not able to, you can't use the money to say, okay, we'll do a CRC shadow report, or we'll do a CEDAW shadow report. And it obviously requires some measure of financial support sometimes to do these reports. And so these state entities would do their national reports and paint a really pretty picture as to what's happening. And on the ground level, it's sometimes far from, what's happening. Another point I want to highlight as it relates to the environment within the Caribbean is, and I think it's tied back again to Jennifer's point around the uptake. And so over the last 10 years, so when we started Man to Man, which was one of the first kinds of engagements that was pro-feminist around engaging men and boys. So we had to navigate and had to, respond in an accountable way to the women's movement and feminist organizations around why we're diverting resources that could be used to help women. And so to a great extent, we would say that we would have won that battle or that argument around it. Where persons, to a great extent, were able to see the value in having those kinds of engagements. But while the traction around engaging men and boys increased, the accountability did not increase. And so you'd have state entities who are sensationalizing the whole engaging men and boys. Many of them, as I said, tied back to funding and being able to appear as if, they're on track with, equality movement. And but really and truly, when you look at the content, oftentimes, of what would happen on the programmatic level, you'd realize that it's far from accountable work. And so we're talking about state levels having gender mainstreaming initiatives that are tied again to funding requirements, right? So yes, they say that if we give you the money to do this, you must report back and say, disaggregated by sex, and and so on, and the impact both on men and women, and so on. And so what you had is these state entities on paper also talking about the uptake in terms of a movement towards gender equality, but really and truly, it was not gender transformative work, in that these programs oftentimes used the monies as or the platforms as opportunities to make statements around men need to take back their rightful place, and you know, and to suggest that, you know, the issues that are happening now is because men are not, you know, in their rightful positions and places, and that is very problematic. And so it has, to a great extent, created a dilemma for Kariman, and I suppose other international counterparts, because it means now that we have to, as an organization that's pro-feminist, you have to, you know, walk on eggshells, because it means that you go into a space and people are automatically assuming that you're here to support the agenda of men taking back, you know, their place, and it's oftentimes an opportunity to kind of clarify if that was the entry point, because sometimes they invite you in because they're expecting that kind of messaging. And so it's an opportunity to clarify, but it also means that sometimes you may not be invited back again, right? But so the uptake has also been challenging for us, and created room for us to be strategic around how you're going to do advocacy in that accountable way, so that we not you know, stepping back, we're not harming the women's movement and the feminist agenda. And so within the Caribbean region, a lot of progress have been made in terms of spaces. And I think the newest kid on the block would be the Spotlight initiative, which is supported in part by the UN system as well as the EU. And for a lot of us in the Caribbean region, and I suppose globally, these world leaders oftentimes see it fitting to support gender equality initiatives in what is oftentimes referred to as the third world, right? And so we're benefactors of many of these initiatives. And so when we talk about the Spotlight initiative within the Caribbean, we're talking about this 3-year-old program that created a very dynamic advocacy space. And I think to a great extent, what it has done for us within civil society it was very interesting when you think about how it was organized as a space, in that it tried to pull together the state, regional, and civil society. And in fact, they created an arm that is referred to as the reference group, right? Which is supposed to be this autonomous space that is almost like a monitoring frame for, you know, how the program is implemented. And that has been an opportunity for us within the Caribbean, because it has somehow consolidated a lot of the work that has happened over the last 10 years within the women's movement and pushing the agenda, gender equality agenda. And in consolidating and creating that framework where the dance that the state oftentimes did with civil society was around, if it is that we don't have money to do a particular project, we'll have civil society partner with us. But once we have the money to do it, sometimes you never hear about them, you never hear from them, right? And so that dance was a very vulgar one for us in civil society, because while we would have developed expertise over the years around some of these thematic areas, for some reason, oftentimes when these states had initiatives around gender equality, engaging men and boys, sexual reproductive health and rights, and so on, there was a deficiency, a significant deficiency. And so sometimes you almost had to hold your breath when you hear them talk about these issues, because oftentimes it's not informed by human rights or equality principles. And so what the Spotlight has done is that it has created a space where it's almost like joint up thinking around the program's implementation. And while there are deficiencies within how it is being implemented, the space nonetheless has been created, and within the regional and local spaces. And so you have Kariman being represented on the regional space, as well as on the local spaces in the 9 islands that within the Caribbean that makes up the Spotlight initiative for the Caribbean region. And so tackling issues around sexual and reproductive health rights has, stepped up on the agenda. and being able to do that in a way that, you know, traditionally it was not joint up thinking, and you had, gender-based violence as it relates to perhaps intimate partner violence having one little space, and then you had LGBTQI in one little space, and all the different intersectionalities were very isolated, very, very silos. And now you have all these persons coming together in that space to really, you know, put forward and do a kind of consolidated approach to advocacy. And I think that makes it powerful. I think in closing, I want to also mention that on the regional level, the Kariman modeled the MenEngage Advocacy Group and has launched its regional Caribbean Advocacy Working Group. And while it is in its early stages, I think it is well positioned to kind of continue the consolidated work that needs to happen as a region, where, you know, we're not operating in isolation as this human right and that human right, but bringing together and creating, you know, looking at human rights as a and tackling it in a very strategic way. And I think that's one of the things that the Kariman Regional Advocacy Working Group will attempt to do, to really build on a lot of the work that has been happening across the region. And so Kariman in that space is very mindful about the other entities that are already doing some of that work and partnering with them in a way that, you know, adds value, but as that also recognizes that as the new kid on the block, as it relates to engaging men and boys, that you know, in a shrinking environment, that you know, we might be able to give, you know, some kick or agitate around moving and continuing in an environment where efforts are, you know, dying, and persons are tired and burned out. And so hopefully advocacy in the Caribbean region is strong and progressive, recognizing deficits as well, but nonetheless is pushing forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shaki, for giving us that very insightful picture into advocacy in the Caribbean. Also highlighting some of the issues, which I think would be issues that we will perhaps hear how other regions have experienced, but the issue of holding our governments accountable to the commitments that they make, that's one thing that is standing out, that particularly, which also emphasizes, or for me, brings the picture in terms of how regional and international advocacy then relates and speaks to our national advocacy. Because like you gave the example of the Caribbean, for me what stands out is how governments want to look good in these international spaces, and yet the reality between what they present in the international and regional advocacy platforms and the reality on the ground, which then also draws that picture in terms of how advocacy from the national feeds or relates to the regional and to the international spaces. So thank you for painting that picture and also highlighting some of the challenges around the shrinking space, which is something that we are experiencing globally. There's this space is shrinking, funding is a challenge, and so which also raises conversation, which also brings the conversation in terms of how do we work around, how do we fashion our work, how do we organize ourselves in light of these shrinking spaces and in light of these challenges that we are facing. And my other takeaway is the issue of responsive interventions, like you were saying, that in some instances survivors and victims of gender-based violence just want the violence to stop. They don't necessarily want to end the relations and all. And being able to frame interventions in such a way that they will be effective, they can also respond to the needs of the survivors and the victims. And also the collaboration was another takeaway for me, how you have framed how the Spotlight Initiative is bringing about creating a space for collaboration and for the able to bring intersectionality between the different human rights issues that are being addressed. So thank you very much for that, for sharing that, and for painting that picture in terms of what is happening. Now I'm going to go and take it to and take it to Africa, I'll bring it to Climate. Climate is part of MenEngage Africa, and is also coming from Namibia, which is part of MenEngage Namibia. So Clivet, I'm going to ask you that you start with a brief introduction of yourself, and then go on and share your experiences in terms of national and regional advocacy from the perspective of MenEngage Africa youth, also from the perspective of your experiences in your country. And kindly note, colleagues, that you can make use of the chat box if you have any questions or any comments that you want to share. Please share them in the chat box, and once we are done with the presentations, we'll take them up during our Q&A. Thank you so much. Clive, over to you.
Thank you very much, Pua. I hope I'm audible to everybody. Am I audible? Can you all hear me?
Yes, you are audible, Clive.
All right, thank you very much, Pua. And wow, I'm quite impressed with the first speaker, Jennifer. She said so much, and literally I feel very small at the moment because even Shaki from the Caribbean said so much and gave so much information. Thank you very much, colleagues. I might not have so much to say. However, I'm going to say what basically is, I'm going to speak more pure on what has been done in regards to advocacy in Namibia. I'm not, I don't think I'm going to cover really in regards to the youth of Africa. I think other colleagues could help me on that. I think there's only one thing that really happened in regards to the advocacy around MenEngage and the youth of Africa. Which is what transpired last year when we were having a paradigm shift really in our governments, where we had most of the governments, I remember, in most of the states in Africa, country states in Africa, Zambia being one of them, Namibia one of them, I think Nigeria as well. Well, where a lot of or most of the young people from different countries really stood together as one to respond to the withdrawal and the opposition in regards to comprehensive sexuality education. That was is part of the ESA commitment that was made by more than 20 countries, 20 governments. So I think that's one of the, actually one of the most highlighting advocacy areas where we responded as young people. I remember very well we were, we coordinated from different countries. We were communicating on Zoom meetings, obviously in the midst of COVID-19, where times were so difficult, still continue to be difficult, but we have managed to really mobilize everyone in Namibia. It was not only the young people, but also we have managed to mobilize some of our political leaders as well. That's including our first lady of the country, who really stood beside us, besides the young people, to respond to the withdrawal or the attempt to withdraw comprehensive sexuality education that should be taken out of schools the government wanted. And I'm very much happy that Jennifer really spoke strongly about the inclusion of comprehensive sexuality education on the international level, because that is something that's very important, and something that really it means a lot to the young people in regards to advocacy, especially the girl child and the boy child, mainly the boy child, knowing what the right decisions and informed decisions they must take. So that in regards to I would say the advocacy around youth in Africa, I saw that was one of the main movements that we really did, amongst others, obviously, that we have discussed on different platforms as we had our meetings on the advocacy level in regards to harmful cultural practices that we must really look into. and try to create a balance between customary law and constitutional law in regards to advocacy, and also creating a safe space when it comes to issues around gender-based violence, and how do we then address these issues in the communities without totally dismissing the customary law, which is the traditional practices, but then creating a balance between constitutional law and customary law. However, like in many other countries as well, as it was mentioned by Shaki from Caribbean, that obviously due to the pandemic, many organizations, especially feminist organizations, had to close their doors. I think that is something that really has transpired in many countries, that has hit a lot of countries, and we saw many doors being closed, especially by organizations that really were advocating on behalf of LGBTQI key population, and also on behalf of the boy child in many countries, Namibia being one of them as well. And really that forced also, or not forced, but also really created a platform for collaboration that was never existing, especially in many organizations. We saw a lot of organizations, a lot of stakeholders really coming to the table to collaborate to address the issues around engaging men with the high number or so spiking number of gender-based violence that has really has risen in most countries in Africa. I was shocked to find out even that the highest crime perpetrated in Lesotho is sexual harassment. That is, if you go into their prison, most of the men that are in prison or that are under correctional services, it's because of sexual harassment. Either they have attempted to rape somebody, or they have physically or abused somebody, or have literally raped someone. And you can see that is literally because of the advocacy in some of the countries where there is not really coordination, the issues or the resources or the capacity even to address issues around gender-based violence, or issues around engaging men and talking to men, and having programs that are really addressing and engaging men meaningfully are really not there in most of these countries. But this is an ongoing thing that we hopefully we see it being materialized, that we really in some of these countries engage men as well. In Namibia as well, if I have to look at Namibia, our country, last year, one of the biggest things that transpired was whereby the young people got really fed up with the justice system in regards to allowing the perpetrator to get away with their crimes that are perpetrating against violence, especially when it comes to really where we had a lot of cases that were taken. And this is an issue that we are actually battling until now, because we have learned that most of cases when it comes to gender-based violence are taken to traditional courts, and then they are then ruled in a traditional way where men are allowed to get away with the crime perpetrated against women, or the crimes that or the gender-based violence perpetrated against women, because of the rulings of the traditional courts that are always ruling in favor of men. So because of this, it also spiked the anger of a lot of young people in the country, and I was one of the young people actually amongst those that there was a protest against the justice system. We were calling it the Shut It All Down protest, where we wanted, or we were protesting that every government office must be shut down, because we want an answer. We are tired. Young people were tired of gender-based violence. Young people were tired of the justice system allowing perpetrators to get away with their crimes. Young people were tired of the police law enforcement not really protecting the lives of young people. Young people are being raped, young people are being violated, young people are being abused, young people are being murdered after being raped. And you just don't see any action from the police or the law enforcement or political leaders coming through. So together with this, it was interesting actually that it happened at the same time with the issue of comprehensive sexuality education, where the government wanted to withdraw. And I think it really, because of that, two things happening at the same time that are really dear to young people, and really has got a lot to do with how young people live, the livelihood of young people, not how young people, but the livelihood of young people. So this spiked a very strong anger where we protest, and we went as far as having dialogues with members of parliament. After this protest, we engaged the president himself as well, through the president's advisor, the youth advisor. We had the AU response to the issues, not only in Namibia, but the issues around Africa, because of gender-based violence, and really meaningfully engaging men, where we had the AU youth envoy, Ms. Aya Chapi, that was traveling in most of the African countries and having dialogues. Namibia is one of them where we had really good and meaningful dialogues with members of parliament when it comes to policies and the system that the young people are growing up in. The boy child is growing up in that system. I remember this was one of the most strongest things that came out, where we really spoke about the amendment of the system, re-looking at the system, revisiting these laws and the policies that are in the system that are enabling some of these crimes to continue, and that are also enabling the young men or the boy child to grow up in a system where they don't really know what to do, or they don't, or they are rather growing up to be perpetrators because of harmful or uncorrected traditional norms, I call them. So we had very meaningful dialogues around this with the members of parliament, with obviously policymakers, which at the moment, it's one of the things that really it's being discussed in parliament. 2 weeks ago as well, actually not even 2 weeks, maybe let me start with the State of Nation of Address that the president has tabled this year of the Republic of Namibia, where he strongly really highlighted the issue of gender-based violence. And his message, if I quote and unquote, was that where there is war and where there is no peace, there is no development. And he was referring to the issues around gender-based violence, and really came out strongly and said that gender-based violence must become a priority in most of all the ministries. It must become a priority in the system, within the community. We must protect each other. We must protect our women. We must protect our men. We must protect our voters. And that he said, our voters, I'm quoting, our voters, he meant obviously the issues around, or not the issue, but the communities like key population and LGBTQI. So this is something that came out very strongly. Also, really at looking at the GBV cluster that the president has really commented on, and commented on the ministry that's leading this, that it's something that really must look into issues around intimate partner violence that I heard about here earlier, that was being mentioned by Sheki, and also you mentioned in Piwa. So issues around intimate partner violence, issues around domestic violence. So look into that with the GBV clusters. He even said that the State House will be working very closely with this cluster to really see how we can address issues around gender-based violence and meaningfully engaging men. And the issue right now at the moment, even I think 2 weeks ago, like I was about to say earlier, we had a dialogue and a training, actually a workshop and training with the standing committee, specifically the subcommittee that is addressing gender-based violence from Parliament. And we've engaged them meaningfully. we unpacked most of these documents that we have in the country, the training manuals on men and boys. We unpacked the Child Protection Act. We unpacked the National Demographic Health Survey, focusing on gender-based violence in Namibia. And with the members of parliament, we went into the course of really and the drivers of gender-based violence and what needs to be done. What are the systems and what are the policies that we must look at? How do we then combat gender-based violence? What training should be given to the law enforcement when it comes to survivors or victims reporting the cases? How do we deal with the survivors? How do we protect the survivors? How do we deal with the perpetrators? So all these things were really brought to the attention, and how we collaborate from the level of civil society organization and really looking at the organizations and the networks that are available, like MenEngage, that are set out there to address the issues around um, gender-based violence and also engaging men meaningfully. Yes, obviously at the moment right now, also in the country, I don't know, Pio, I don't know if you have heard what Namibia is also going through. Maybe you guys have heard there that it's like every time we try to reach a conclusion or a solution where we can work together, something comes out very strongly. Recently in Namibia, we had an issue around two surrogate children that were two babies that were obviously denied the citizenship or the permit to enter the country and to be with their parents, which are both of the same sex, male. And it is a case that has been going on. And finally, I think last week the government has granted these the surrogates, the babies, permits to come into the country. But and the reason why I'm mentioning this is like the same week, the minister of justice in the country, in Namibia, has also proposed the amendment and the tabling of the bill of the homosexual bill, to, in other words, to allow same sex to get married. And this is at the moment, I can tell you, things are not going well in the country because we have politicians that are turning against each other. Because finally, of course, this is what we wanted. This is the shift we wanted. For many years, we did ask the government in our country to really bring up and come up with a stand in their position in regards to LGBTQI, in regards to partners of the same sex. Where do we stand? Am I, in other words, am I allowed to be a gay person in my country? Am I allowed to be a lesbian? And for many years, we've been asking for the government to come up with a stand. And interestingly, we are having at the moment the Minister of Justice that is attempting to table this bill. And things are not really looking good, but we are hopeful that really this comes through, it goes through, because it's really having a lot of oppositions. We, a civil society organization, from the level of civil society organization, we are really collaborating and working together, holding hands, putting our minds together, and how we can respond and how we can help impact and how we can also help to see this bill through. Pio, I didn't introduce myself properly in the beginning. I wanted to do it in the end to the colleagues that are listening. My name is Clivet Mwandingi. That's my surname. I have a lot of names actually because I'm half Portuguese, half Namibian. So I have Hernandez. I'm one of those people with many names, 7 names. However, I'm the chairperson of MenEngage in Namibia. I'm also the advocacy person at the regional level. That's why I'm at this meeting. And on top of that, I'm the president of a youth-led organization, a very vibrant youth-led organization called African Youth and Adolescent Network on Population Development. That's AFRIAN. It's in more than 24 countries in Africa. And I'm also in, serving at a very difficult position. I call it a position between a rock and a hard place, because I'm part of civil society organization. At the same time, I am part of this protocol, state security. And recently, I think I've mentioned it in our last meeting that I've been appointed as the chairperson of the research committee of the National Parliament. So you can see the position where I am at the moment. I'm sitting with people who are asking me to do research for them to get material to be able to oppose the bill. And on the other hand, I'm sitting with people who are telling me, or who are actually working together with me to be able to make sure that this bill goes through. So my left hand is not speaking to my right hand at the moment. They are enemies. Pure, that's all I have to say from Namibia and from the level of advocacy around young people. But obviously, if I think of something, I'll make my contributions, my input. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Clivette, for also giving us that insightful picture in terms of advocacy work in Namibia and illustrating how young people have been taking a stand and the impact of coordinated advocacy by young people. For me, the takeaway being the comprehensive sexuality education advocacy initiatives that you embarked on as young people and were able to achieve those goals and to have to ensure that the government continues to commit to providing CSE. So thank you very much for that intervention and also for providing that leadership and for also sharing in terms of some of the GBV initiatives in the space. That I think the one thing that keeps coming up is the space that we are operating, that when we are doing advocacy work, these are the conditions, this is the space that we're doing our advocacy under. We are experiencing much resistance when it comes to issues of CSE, when it comes to effectively addressing GBV. We're still facing a lot of gaps and a lot of challenges that are coming up, and also just to give us an understanding in the framework in terms of where Namibia as a country is at and some of the initiatives that are happening. So thank you very much for that informative presentation and that conversation, and certainly all the best in terms of the position and the hats that you're sitting in, and which I am sure if used strategically can help to move the agenda forward. So, and yes, we will be able to take these conversations further beyond the space. There is still need for us to continue engage as an alliance in terms of how do we take our work forward in light of the resistance and the space within which we are operating. Thank you very much. Now we're going to move on. We are still in the MenEngage Africa region. I'm going to hand over to Hassan. Hassan is the chair of MenEngage Africa. He is going to share with us in terms of our advocacy work from the Africa regional perspective. Hassan, I'm just going to hand over to you. You can briefly introduce yourself and then go ahead and share with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mpiwa. I'm glad to be here. If there's any platform that I would not miss is to be on this session of the Ubuntu Symposium, talking about our work as the Alliance. So I'm speaking about the work from Africa. Clivette has spoken about the work in Namibia. And as MenEngage Africa, we are looking at Namibia very, very closely because they have been able to narrow the gender gap. We know there's a lot of work that still has to be done, but at least they have been able to narrow the gender gap. And they are showing us that, yes, it is possible. Now, our advocacy work on the African region takes an integrated approach, okay? We use an integrated approach in doing our advocacy, and this is because we have quite a number of issues to deal with. So we can't have an approach that deals with the issue by issue by issue. We integrate our advocacy so that we are able to reach out quite a number of people. So still on the African continent, the way we do our advocacy is that we have created structures to enable us reach out in an integrated way to all the people that we have to reach out to. We are a network, a regional network of 22 countries spread out across Africa. We are talking about Southern Africa, we are talking about East Africa, we are talking about West Africa, and we also talk about Central Africa, because we're present in all those regions. So what we've been able to do as a region to make sure that our advocacy efforts are well coordinated, we create structures. We have the advocacy working group, whereby all the countries, the 22 countries, have been able to front nominees to that advocacy working group, so that we can be able to do our advocacy in a coordinated way, but also to know what are the country efforts that are going on in the different countries. We have the governance working group, and this is where the chairpersons of all the country networks convene. We have that group there, and it's also one of our channels of talking about where are we, what advocacy do we need to do, what is going on, so that we try and move together, but also build a community of practice amongst ourselves. We also have the country coordinators. These are people who are at the job on a daily basis. So the country coordinators also have a platform where they congregate, and because they are working daily with our member organizations to make sure that gender equality and men being part of the solution actually happens. So they also have a platform, and we get a lot of learning from the coordinators, country coordinators working group. So in terms of structure, that is how it looks like when we do our advocacy initiatives. Now, how do we do this advocacy? I know the Caribbean spoke quite a lot about what they are doing. How do we do this advocacy? We are in two spaces at the regional level, okay? Regional level means we are at the African Union. We're breaking into the spaces at the African Union and doing all sorts of advocacy. One of the things we've been able to do and achieve with our advocacy is the issue of getting into policy the language of men and boys. Hitherto, that was unknown in policy on the regional level. Okay, we are participating in high-level dialogues at the African Union. A vivid example is silencing the gun, because African Union has that campaign of silencing the guns by 2030. So we are participating in that space, and we are talking about engagement we're talking about militarized masculinities and how we can work around these masculinities to be able to support Africa to silence the guns by 2030. So we get into those spaces and be able to do that advocacy. But even if we're at the regional spaces, we are also present in country spaces, and we have a lot of processes going on at country level to make sure that our advocacy is really meeting the agenda that we are setting. We're also at sub-regional. Africa has sub-regional regional economic forums. So like the East African community, the West African community, the ECOWAS, the SADC. We're also into those spaces. Our members, our country networks are into these spaces, and we use these spaces to make sure that we continue to push, we continue to show that we are here, we are allies, and we need to work on the issue of language, the language of working with men and boys. And we are increasingly seeing fruits from our advocacy, that they involving our members into policy development, involving our members into policy implementation. And people are increasingly on the African continent beginning to understand the work with men and boys. So the more they continue to understand the work with men and boys, the more we get encouraged, and the more we continue to do this work to make sure that we actually get the change systems that are desired. We're also present at the global level, and I will not say much about that because Jennifer did talk a lot about that. We're also present at the global level, the CSW that Jennifer was talking about. And one of the things we've been able to learn is that for us on the African continent to be able to hold governments accountable, on reporting mechanisms and participating in these reports, we have learned that it is increasingly important for us, one, to get observer status. Okay, get observer status at the AU, get observer status at the regional regs. So, because if you're not an observer, it means the processes of reporting and you're going to be out of that process. But when you have an observer status, then you are in a good position to hold governments accountable for not reporting, for not domesticating, for not ratifying, okay, for not doing ascension. So many of these processes are around the global policy are better done. Advocacy is much more easier when you have an observer status. We are still trying to get into the spaces, working with our country network in Ethiopia, to get into the small spaces at the African Union, especially the commissions. The commissions at the African Union have lots of processes going on, and we need to get into those spaces and be able to influence advocacy at that level. We have advocacy at country level. Our countries are reporting a lot of advocacy processes. Now, I also have to be cautious that at country level, as we engage in advocacy spaces, we are very cognizant that we do not take the space of women's rights organizations. That is a key point for us. So in most of the advocacy processes at country level, we continuously engage our coordinators, our chairpersons, okay, to make sure that they are not there to take the space of the women's rights organizations, but they are there to act as allies, okay? They are there to work in solidarity with the women's rights organizations, with the feminist movements, so that we are not looked at as people who are competing, because indeed we are not competing. So at country level, lots of processes are going on. In Nigeria, a progressive law on female genital mutilation last year was passed, and we congratulate our members in Nigeria for the efforts that they did. When we come to Kenya, again, Kenya on FGM, the law initially had not realized the value of working with men and boys to end FGM, but the national strategy was launched, and the wording in there is very strong on working with men and boys. And our counterparts in Kenya have done quite a good job doing workshops, engaging men, and making sure that men are part of this solution to end female genital mutilation. When we come to Botswana, at country level, Botswana in 2020 was very, very applauded for a progressive law judgment in the court about LGBTIQ rights. So our members in Botswana were at the center stage of making sure that this legislation actually comes to, this court ruling actually comes to a logical conclusion. When we come to Burundi, a lot of youth processes in Burundi have been going on at country level. Rwanda is one of the countries on the continent with progressive laws around gender issues. One of the countries that are moving closer to closing the gender gap, and one of the countries in Africa that has a high percentage of women in politics, women in parliament. And our members there are enjoying a good working relationship with the governments there to make sure that work with men and boys is not something that you have to look for when you enter Rwanda. And there's no doubt that they are hosting the Ubuntu Symposium. We also have, Tanzania has done a lot of work around FGM and child marriages. That is an area where we are working on. Uganda has done a lot of work around SRHR, making sure that the work of men and boys in the SRHR policies is there. We still have a lot of political backlash in policy advocacy, but we are managing that. Most recently, our parliament did pass the sexual offences bill, and it was criminalizing sex work and also criminalizing LGBTQ. So there's a lot of work for us to do, but we are optimistic. The president did make a mention that he would not be signing this into law because of some foreign policy issues. So we did a lot of work on this sexual offences bill, but we were very disappointed when the final debate in Parliament was really a total disappointment to our efforts. But that does not mean we have gone down. We're still doing a lot of work around that. So There are also spaces like Kotla, the African Coalition of Traditional Leaders. Okay, we're doing across the continent, we're doing a lot of work working with traditional leaders from Southern Africa to West Africa. Traditional leaders, religious leaders is a space where we're doing a lot of advocacy. And this is for a reason that, I mean, Africa is the home to about 56 different types of people, okay? And about 2,000 languages. So that makes the advocacy with traditional leaders, religious leaders, such an important thing for us and how we do our work. And we are beginning to get progress. The progress on traditional leaders is slow and religious leaders, but there's big hope that we have progressive traditional leaders. We have progressive cultural leaders, okay, like the prince from Lesotho and many others that we work with across the continent. And we were also part of the East African community. That's a regional REC when they were coming out with the gender policy to make sure that we really get in there and get the language with men and boys. Some of the backlash we have got is that, for example, the regional RECs, when a policy is passed, they have a law that says that 3 years after a policy is passed, if the heads of state do not sign to it, then it is null and void. So most of the processes we have engaged in regionally, the heads of state don't sign the laws, don't sign the bills into law. And 3 years pass, and now you have to start all over afresh. So this is some of the problem that we're having. Now, on the African continent, we have a huge backlash. The reason why it's only 7 countries out of 54 in Africa that have been able to have some progressive laws around LGBT issues is because the African political leadership, the political class in Africa, has phobia for the word rights. When you just say the word rights, it's just phobia across the continent, okay? So that is why progress around LGBTIQ issues is very slow in Africa. It seems like as if there's no work being done, but actually work is being done. But the issue is that the political class just doesn't want the word rights. In some spaces, for example, we have the sexuality framework in my country. And the debate around using the word rights and using the word comprehensive was such a huge debate. And finally, the politicians had to say, we don't want to see those words in this document. You people of civil society, and then blaming, the blame game had to start. So even when we went to the East African community, same thing, the word rights was the reason why this sexual reproductive health bill did not come out of the East African Parliament, because the heads of state said the word rights should be dropped from sexual reproductive health. Drop the word rights, we don't want to see it. And advocacy now comes back to a complete standstill. We have been able to be behind the efforts of a scorecard in Southern Africa. There's a scorecard that really tracks the processes in Southern Africa that hold governments accountable. But also, our members are behind the efforts of the gender barometer. There's a gender barometer that runs in 9 countries of East Africa, 9 countries. And this is a barometer that measures responsiveness of governments towards gender issues, how they are reporting, how they are domesticating, and how they are ratifying all these processes. So these are the processes that our members, our country networks are engaged in to make sure that the advocacy on the African continent becomes more progressive, becomes intense, but also includes the language around men and boys, so that men and boys can get part of these processes and are able to drive the change that we are looking for. So those are some of the issues I can talk about, but also we have our own spaces. Of course, we have the MenEngage Africa Symposium. That is a space where we do regional advocacy as the African region, and that happens every 2 years. We are now gearing up for the next one. We have members participating in country reports to the UN, to the peer review mechanism, and the peer review mechanism has become one of the most respected on the African continent. Our political class may not respect reports to the UN and all that stuff, but the peer review the most highly respected by African states, and they always make sure that a country report exists. They are reporting continuously. Countries have taken 12 years, 15 years without reporting on instruments at the UN. But for the peer review mechanism, you have a lot of participation of countries there. We are also doing a lot of advocacy around the forces. And when I say the forces, I mean the police, I mean the military. Our country networks are doing a lot of advocacy work with the military, trying to work on these militarized masculinities, Sierra Leone, Rwanda, Congo, lots of spaces where we are participating. So those are the advocacy efforts I can talk about on the African region, and we are hosting the Ubuntu Symposium has opened up a big array of advocacy space for us, and we are gearing up to fit into the space and be able to take this agenda even much further. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hassan, for giving us that very detailed overview of and taking us through the journey of and sharing what is happening in the different countries, and also unpacking the different spaces where our advocacy, where our advocacy work is, and also some of the challenges that we're experiencing across the continent in terms of issues around rights and how politicians respond to that, and the shrinking spaces. And so in the interest of time, I'm not going to repeat a lot of what you've shared, just to say thank you for highlighting those. We are now going to move ahead, and we are going to go to Anthony, who's from the MENA region. And Anthony is also going to take us through the journey of advocacy in that region. I'll just ask that you start by briefly introducing yourself, Anthony, then you can take us through. And to other participants, feel free to use the chat box to comment. Once the presentations are done, we'll engage with some of the comments, and we can then engage with some of the presentations that have come out of this dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mpua, and thank you everyone from the MenEngage Network for having us with you today, and for attending and being with us to hear our thoughts. I will attempt to be as brief as possible, because so many of my colleagues have said so much in terms of global advocacy that is also generalizable to different regions, specifically ours, especially about issues of accountability. But Lebanon and the MENA region is a bit different in terms of, for the longest time, we've been a region that has been immersed in conflict and violence and war, and that really hasn't changed. Lebanon as a state within the past 2 years have seen peaceful revolutions attempted in October 2019. Since then, nothing has happened at that point. It was a very youthful-led campaign to start out with, those protests calling for the end of corruption from the political elite in Lebanon, calling for all of these political leaders who have basically used their positions in Lebanon, not for the people, for the progress of the citizens, for the rights, especially the rights of women and girls and LGBTQI and people of different abilities and other marginalized populations, but rather as positions to consolidate their power and influence that they have, and that they had since the Civil War. Most of our political leaders are the military or militia leaders during the Civil War. And so we talk about militarized masculinities, and I think in Lebanon it's a very pertinent issue that a lot of our advocacy, or a lot of our discussions and interventions in terms of advocacy in the global arena do have to center around. However, in terms of regional and national advocacy, I would say that the situation right now of Lebanon nationally, as well as regional advocacy efforts, is very dreary, very demoralizing, to use a different word perhaps. Nationally, again, despite protests that were nationwide, absolutely nothing has changed in terms of the the country or national leadership or the political landscape. There has been limited space made available to women and other marginalized people. There have been limited spaces that accommodate civil society, despite civil society in Lebanon being very strong politically. The amount of influence has even decreased since pre-2019, especially the revolution days and before the onset of Corona. A large part of that has to do with the health efforts that have been taken because of the pandemic, and again, the lack of response or accountability or actual aid in terms of what the government provides. But the same activists who were there on the ground beginning these revolutions also had a certain ethical responsibility to respect the public health needs of the country and how this pandemic affected our silencing our voice, perhaps in different spaces, how the government might have even used the pandemic and these different health considerations in order to decrease the level of fervorance of that activism at the time. And regionally, the Arab League is non-committal towards anything. It's very hard. They don't respond to civil society quite well. It seems simply a regional body that was created for the sake of show, rather than any attempt to hear the needs of the different peoples from the region, especially marginalized people. Zero attention to women and girls, and rather just to keep up appearances in the global arena, and again, efforts to consolidate their power or to make their leadership seem genuine by engaging in different international mechanisms or by creating this regional advocacy body. And at the end of the day, it has not been useful yet towards any regional efforts towards gender equality, women and girls, or non-violence in the region, when we still see that conflict and war is the rule of law more so than the actual law in the regions in which we live. Similar to many of my colleagues, there's a complete lack of accountability. Again, on a national level, I bring to everyone's recollection the Beirut blast that gained global attention last August, to which nothing has really been done. Investigations are chaotic and confusing. There's absolutely no accountability to the people who were affected by the blast, nor again in terms of the repetitions for the calls for the removal of the political elite in Lebanon who have been corruptly ruling since the days of the civil war, by both the political parties in power currently in the government, as well as the oppositions who at some point even co-opted the protests in order to make a push for their own political power. And on the margins are every citizen in Lebanon. And then we talk about the margins of the margins, and we talk about women, girls, refugee populations, people of different abilities, the LGBTQI population, in which absolutely no advocacy has been done, except on the community level by organizations such as ours and other fellow NGOs and CSOs in the region. So here we're looking again at mechanisms by which UN bodies who are also part of a global political system, as well as governments. At this point, it just seems like a lot of lip service. There aren't many options in terms of advocacy. We do our best in terms of being in those international spaces. Again, especially our organization does have the privilege of being in a position where our voices are heard in the international arena. However, again, how much this was affected by the corona pandemic in terms of not being able to physically be in those spaces, network with other activists, develop coherent strategies that sometimes are just facilitated by being in that physical space as well as in that theoretical space. And I think we have felt the causal effect of that pandemic in terms of the power of our advocacy over the past few years. In terms of engaging men and boys, I think it's so wonderful to see how much this is being recognized by different governments and different actors on the global level, on regional levels. However, I definitely agree with many critiques from the feminist movement in terms of the crux, the very heart of transformative masculinities and masculinities that challenge patriarchal masculinities is transformation in and of itself. Not a superficial tossing of a word that is very trendy, or a non-committal statement that accentuates the need to engage men and boys without really realizing at the heart of that is committing to the transformation of power and how that power manifests itself from the micro levels in terms of domestic violence and the benefits and privileges that men have over women in those spaces, such as Lebanon, the personal status laws that are still one of the greatest hindrances to women's rights in the country, to the macro levels, women's political participation, women's economic empowerment, which is, again, in terms of Lebanon, non-existent on any level. And so despite the acknowledgement of these efforts or the need for engaging men and boys on the global and international and regional levels, the critical intersectional feminist framework does impose upon us in order to abide by that framework, to be critical and to ask what beyond the acknowledgement of the engagement of men and boys is necessary. And if you truly wish to engage men and boys and work on masculinities from this feminist perspective, which, again, when we talk about even restorative justice, that women, girls, and marginalized populations always need to be at the center of the method by which we hold ourselves accountable to them. It can't be men holding themselves accountable to other men without recognizing the voices of women. It can't be governments who still lack different measures of equality on a systemic level, holding themselves accountable to other governments in power who don't have those accountability measures in place. So really to challenge ourselves to acknowledge the success of this issue showing itself more in international spaces, but not being satisfied with that and really pushing for that to be something of substance rather than being something simply to fit in or to project oneself as being progressive without actually the accountability that so much focus has been put on in this conversation and in a lot of MenEngage's work. Lastly, I will say, I mean, there's so much to still say about our region, but I will say in terms of our region, I also feel the need to listen to these feminist critiques in so many of the things we're talking about, because although we still do dedicate ourselves as an organization and as activists to a lot of these mechanisms and the international spaces for advocacy that can eventually come and catalyze change that's needed for the rights of women and girls and all marginalized peoples, but also to ask ourselves how much we are attempting to use the master's tools and simply running in place in our attempts to do so. I think many within the theories of militarized masculinities and the narrative within the different theories of militarized masculinities, there is an acknowledgement of the almost contradictory paradoxes that exist in terms of power over and dominance and obedience to a hierarchy, and on the other side mentioning protection and camaraderie and the collective good within the same narrative of militarized masculinities. And many times we have to ask ourselves whether that is strategic, whether signing documents or taking part in these mechanisms or making statements, are simply a distractionary tactic, perhaps to whiten one's image a bit in lieu of other militarized actions that are being taken, whether in the country or in the region, or the ineffectual nature of actual reforms made to women and girls, and work on gender justice in the region or in the country or what have you. So I definitely think that, yes, someone wrote the quote I mentioned from Audre Lorde. So we do really need to make sure that we're not falling into the trap of simply using the master's tools, and we need to be vocally critical of that in order for there to not only be acknowledgement of the need to engage men and boys, but the acknowledgement to do that in a particular feminist approach that is sensitive to intersectionalities, and that really puts an emphasis on restorative justice, reparations, reconciling the violence between different populations, and really seeing how engaging men and boys can actually lead to the support of initiatives for women and girls in the country. Then lastly, I would say specifically about normative frameworks. Again, from our perspective, from our positionality in the MENA region, it is difficult to, again, while reasserting our affirmation and our commitment to working in these different advocacy spaces, one does have to ask questions about the level of violence in the region and the international apathy in terms of actual things being done with regard to what's happening right now in Palestine. The complete lack of mention of how the conflict that does exist not only is a violation of human rights in general, but specifically how that impacts women and girls on different levels and different marginalized people. And it requires much more than a statement of consolation or a statement that calls for a ceasefire with actually no actions. So how can we commit to gender justice when we have not yet taken a stance against militarism and violence in our region? And I think from our regional perspective, from our national perspective, these are still a lot of the issues that we're attempting to work out, and still looking for the proper venues in which we can do so. And a lot of that has been done with the MenEngage network, along with other actors, and we're very appreciative of those partnerships, and we hope for them to continue, again, along with the guidance and leadership of different feminist actors and collectives, regionally and globally. So thank you for the time. I'll stop there. Again, I'm Anthony Kade. I'm the Masculinities Technical Advisor at Abad Resource Center for Gender Equality, and thank you for having me. Back to you, Mpiwa.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for that conversation and for highlighting many complex issues that come with advocacy within a region that is experiencing so much conflict, and also for highlighting, for bringing up that important conversation. For me, it's the takeaway was the reminder that when we're talking about engaging men and boys, we're not just talking about engaging men and boys for the sake of it. There is an ultimate objective, which is the transformation of power, which is addressing intersectionality and using a feminist lens in doing this, that in engaging men and boys, do not want to perpetuate or to use to quote you, that we need to make sure that be aware that we do not use the master's tools, because otherwise we are going to be reinforcing the very same toxic masculinities, the inequality that we are trying to dismantle in the ways that, so we need to be very cognizant of the ways and the approaches within which we do this issue of engaging men and boys, and the issue of accountability, which is a thread that has been coming through from all the presentations. I think one critical takeaway has been the need for accountability. And I think it was also important that you highlighted some very important and critical issues, that issue of militarized masculinities. We are talking about engaging men and boys, but we have an issue, we have masculinities that are militarized, and we are seeing some of the challenges that are coming with that. You've mentioned Palestine and how it cannot just be lip service. We cannot just say, oh, we stand in solidarity with Palestine and end it there. what needs to be really done. How do we begin to engage with that protracted conflict, inequality, and that equal power balance that is at play, and all those issues that you're highlighting. So thank you very much for that very insightful conversation. Now I will open up. I know that our time has really gone, but I'll just open up to say if there's anyone who has a burning comment, question or comment, feel free to say that. I see that there was a comment that was posted by Paul Osayande, who was responding to Private's presentation. This shares that it is generally the same experience in Nigeria as I believe you know, perhaps maybe only in different degrees. The shrinking space may have been widened or worsened in Nigeria because of the gap between policymakers, CSOs, and the populace. So getting to engage policymakers, especially for accountability, is challenging. Again, the need to improve on consulting and collaborating with feminist groups to effect behavioral and attitudinal change is currently brewing. We must effect as quickly as possible because of the fast-growing social or security issues in the country. So Paul was also sharing about some of the security issues that are in the country and the challenges that are there with the shrinking space. So I'll briefly open it up for comments to find out if you have any comments or any responses to the presentations that have been given, that have presented and created and painted this overview in terms of our advocacy work at the different tiers that we engage with. Okay, there seems to be no comment, or there seems to be no further question that's been posted in the chat box. So at this point, would really like to thank all our participants and all our presenters. Thank you so much for that conversation, because many times when we are sitting and we are doing our advocacy work, there's always the question of how does the advocacy work, or how does what happens on the ground, how is it affected or impacted by the advocacy, international advocacy spaces, or how are the international advocacy spaces or the regional spaces and outcomes of those spaces, how are they useful to our day-to-day realities at the national level, and how do we make use of them. I think from this conversation, when we've realized in terms of processes and how some of the resolutions that are made or that are decided on in international space, we can then bring them to the national space and begin to hold our decision makers and accountable for implementing those resolutions or for implementing the commitments that they've made at those different levels, the regional and the international level. And at the same time is also what Jennifer alluded to earlier. What happens at the national level also helps to input and feed into advocacy initiatives that then happen at the different tiers. It helps in driving those advocacy and informing advocacy initiatives that we do. And critically, the issue of being accountable, to understand that our work, we are accountable to feminist organizations, we are accountable to women's rights organizations and institutions, and we work as allies. So we are also, and also the need for us to be cognizant, to be always cognizant that when we are doing this work, we do not in the end entrench some of the toxic and harmful power dynamics and inequalities that are already existing, but that if anything, we work to amplify work of feminist organizations, the work of women's rights organizations, and the work of the feminist movement, and critically being able to be accountable. So thank you very much everyone for sharing this, and hopefully we will be able to continue with all these conversations. And I just want to hand over to my colleague Jennifer for closing remarks before we call it a day.
Piwa, thank you so much. Actually, you led us through the closing remarks. I'll just wrap up the session just with a few more announcements. Let me share my screen. But of course, just a really wonderful session. Thanks to all colleagues. I learned a lot, as always, no? I'm really appreciative of you for leading us through this session, Mipiwa. just for all participants, and thank you to participants for joining too. Just to connect with you as we're fast approaching the end of the symposium. It's been an 8-month-long effort. And just to let you know, for those who are joining for the first time, we do continue to have sessions on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. And if you want more information on the symposium, then please do connect at this link. And that's it from our end. Warm thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your day, whether it's evening or afternoon or morning. Thank you so much.